Hello, welcome to our online summit on personalized learning. My name is Kevin Bushweller. I'm an assistant managing editor for Education Week who oversees our coverage of educational technology and learning environments. We did a special report about personalized learning recently that included a nationally representative survey of 600 teachers. We also compared that against some survey work on personalized learning that we did with principals. We talked a lot about these issues in the discussion we just had with our audience, but we're gonna talk more about some of the difficulties of personalized learning, what teachers think about it, what principals think about it, and how new technologies are shaping it. So I wanted to start with Allison Klein, our lead technology writer, and just ask you sort of a basic big picture question, which is, how do teachers see personalized learning? What difficulties do they see in it?
So that's a great question, Kevin. We did, as you may know, a nationally representative survey of about 600 teachers this year, just on all of their attitudes and thoughts and challenges and what they see as promising in personalized learning. So only 21%, so just about a fifth, see it as something that can be transformational. About 25% see it as like a good strategy, and another quarter see it as a promising idea. Just 11% just see it as a passing fad. So it sounds like teachers feel like personalized learning is here to stick around. I've been thinking about that, small figure relatively small figure when it comes to the idea that personalized learning is transformational. And in our summit today, when we were chatting with teachers and readers, one of the guests that I brought on, and one expert that I've talked to, mentioned that it can take 5 to 10 years for transformational change to really take hold. And I know you've been covering personalized learning, Kevin and Michelle, for how long? How long has it really been on the scene?
So I think we've been covering it Education Week for probably like 7 or 8 years.
Yeah,
and it has continued to evolve, but it has a long way to go too.
Sure.
And that's one thing I wanted to ask you, sort of a follow-up, is you talked to a lot of teachers for the story that you did that included the survey results. What were some of their, more nuanced perspectives about personalized learning? Where did they see potential problems or opportunities?
So some of the biggest, fears, I guess, when it comes to teachers and personalized learning, the biggest one, and this probably doesn't come as a surprise, was screen time. So 72% of the teachers that we surveyed mentioned that they were really worried about kids just spending so much time on screens because personalized learning has, in many districts, such a strong technology component. And they were also worried about kids working alone as often as they do, and the tech industry having too much of a say in classroom instruction. There's also some concerns that parents have brought up. I spoke with a teacher actually earlier this month, John Davenport, who teaches middle school social studies out in California. And he is just a huge personalized learning enthusiast. He loves personalized learning, and it's really transformed his practice. But his principal recently told him to scale back his approach. He's still doing a bit of the personalized approach, but he's going to be doing a lot more direct lecturing to his students. And that was in part because of pushback from parents who really worried about this reliance on technology. And I thought that was really interesting. So I think teachers see it as something that can really help engage kids and help them, make sure that they're playing to their strengths and keeping up with their weaknesses. But it's also, people are still trying to navigate exactly how much of a role technology should have in it.
It's really interesting you talk about the overuse of technology, because we just published a story recently on edweek.org about NAEP reading scores going down, and there might be a connection to too much screen time. So Michelle, you've covered technology for a number of years now. You were covering it 7 or 8 years ago when it was a very new thing. Now you're looking at things like artificial intelligence, which is a very sophisticated technology. Is there pushback with that too? What did you find in your reporting?
Well, there definitely is pushback. I think a lot of things fall under this term of artificial intelligence right now. People are looking at sort of adaptive learning systems, machine learning. But I think there are some concerns by teachers that some of what they do will be displaced by these artificial intelligence systems. But when I was interviewing my guest, Andreas Orania from ETS, he really felt like the power and the promise of artificial intelligence in personalized learning is around freeing up teachers to do sort of the direct coaching and mentoring and the more sophisticated instruction. And that AI could do some other things like help choose a learning path for students to understand how they learn and help guide them through a path, providing some feedback, some grading, and some automated tasks that allow teachers to do other things.
So is that sort of looking down the road into the future, or are there uses of AI that he is seeing now in K-12 education?
There are definitely uses right now. A lot of products out there say that they use AI. Sometimes they're really talking more about adaptive learning, things like that. But there definitely are some ways that AI are being used now to provide feedback to students, to do assessment, and to learn how students are understanding material and grasping material and guiding them through a learning process.
So with all these technologies, you need more professional development. And what does the professional development look like, or what kind of feedback did you get about professional development for personalized learning, Allison?
So in the overall broader survey, teachers were kind of, not so enthusiastic about the professional development they were getting. About 42% said it was effective, but not very consistent. And just a quarter thought it was effective. And the rest really thought it was ineffective or wasn't really happening at all. I did talk to, in the course of my reporting, some individual teachers who said their districts were doing amazing things when it came to professional development. I talked to one teacher who her district had allowed her to visit schools even in other states to see how their personalized learning was playing out. And I think the challenges with that kind of level of professional development are pretty obvious, right? Schools may not have the budget or the time to offer that. One teacher I talked to said it would just be great if she and her colleagues could sit around and share ideas on how to make how to make personalized learning work better, but that they just don't have time in their schedule.
Right.
Well, that kind of leads me a little bit to what you wrote about for our personalized learning report. In our survey, we found that teachers were much more skeptical of personalized learning than principals. Why is that?
I think what people told me was that teachers are the ones who have to make this work in the classroom, and they also don't like to have technologies pushed on them, and so there's going to be a little bit of resistance there. I think also, though, what I found was that in the districts where they involve teachers in crafting a definition and a strategy for personalized learning, there's not as much resistance. In fact, even there's enthusiasm for it. But when it's a top-down initiative where they just push it on teachers and, push a one-to-one initiative too, that's where you get that resistance.
Well, I think it's really interesting. You talked to a principal who actually put himself in the role of a teacher to find out what teachers were really dealing with.
Yeah, which is a form of professional development in and of itself. So Adam Bunting, he's the principal of Champlain Valley Union High School in Vermont. It's the largest high school in the state. And he taught a class it was 2 or 3 weeks at the end of last school year so that he could better understand the challenges that teachers were facing in trying to figure out how to make these approaches work. So I wanted to follow up, Allison, too. This came up in the discussions in the audience today too, which is really interesting. It's not just about the technology,
No,
right?
Yeah, definitely not. So the technology, I think, enables personalized learning. But a lot of the experts I've talked to talked about all these other things that are really the hallmark of it. It's really about getting students to take ownership of their learning, and for learning to be, made relevant to what their skills are, what their interests are, where they want to go in life. And so that can mean letting students set their own goals. That's something that you can do with or without technology. Having students decide how they're going to be graded. Again, something you could do with or without technology. Tailoring lessons to students' personal interests. All of that does not necessarily need to involve a computer, but all of that it's difficult. It can be hard to do.
Right. right, the multi-age grouping.
Yes,
Tell us
yes.
about that.
So I wrote a story about I was right there with you.
Yeah.
I wrote a story about schools that are trying out a multi-age grouping approach. So the idea there is for you to group students a little bit more by ability and not so much by age, and also give older students the opportunity to mentor younger students, even when it comes to things like classroom rules in a kindergarten, first grade classroom. And that's something that the teachers and principals that I've talked to who are trying it out say is very worthwhile, but it's really hard. One principal told me that this is one of the hardest things her school has ever tried. She said that I wouldn't want to say making it up as they go along, but they're really teaching, she said teaching in beta, that this was sort of a whole new way for her teachers to approach instruction.
So go ahead,
Well, I
Michelle.
was just going to say, even from an artificial intelligence perspective, the technology isn't everything. Andreas was talking to me about the fact that when you have an AI system, it's really important to have the ability for the teacher to override that system when they don't agree with the recommendations of the AI system. If the system's saying a student's not ready to move on, but the teacher feels that they are ready for the next challenge, it's really important to be able to do that.
And there are also real serious ethical considerations with the use of AI too, right?
There are, because AI learns through the data that's input. It's only as good as the data that you put in that it's learning from. So if the data is skewed, or if it's data that comes from a different group of students or a different type of students and it's being applied in a way that doesn't make sense, there can really be a problem.
So I want to get back to making this work. So what elements of personalized learning do teachers seem to find most difficult?
It's a lot of those things that we just talked about that aren't part of the technology, right? So again, like setting learning goals, that's something that you can do with maybe older students. But when I talked to, first and second grade teachers, some of them said that was something that they felt comfortable with if there was a lot of professional development and supports in their school. But others felt that their kids just were not mature enough to be able to do that, or were not mature enough to be able to figure out how they would be graded. Or even to be in a classroom with kids who were a different age than they were. So it can be very challenging to bring in these sort of other elements that the technology doesn't necessarily enable, and that just expects a lot of changes on the part of the teacher.
Okay, and we're going to end it on that note. Thank you so much for joining us today for our online summit. I would encourage you to go to edweek.org and check out our special report about personalized learning. And next up, we'll be having a discussion with Sarah Schwartz and Madeline Will about academic pacing and Genius Hour. Hello, welcome back to our discussion about personalized learning. My name is Kevin Bushweller. I'm an assistant managing editor for Education Week. I oversee our coverage of educational technology and learning environments. And I have two Education Week writers with me today, Sarah Schwartz and Madeline Will, who cover teacher issues for Education Week. So they have some great insights into the teaching profession and personalized learning, and where we're going on the road ahead with that trend. So I'm going to jump right into it with you, Sarah. One of the issue that Sarah wrote about in our personalized learning special report was academic pacing. And what are the sort of the difficulties that teachers have in trying to make that work in the classroom?
Yeah, so one is just sort of the practicality of it. Often teachers are given a pacing guide that they're expected to follow throughout the year that says, by this point you're supposed to have covered this topic, by this point you're supposed to have mastered this skill, and that can sometimes be quite rigid, but the teachers at a couple of different schools where I talked to some educators were finding some creative ways to sort of get around that and work within that structure. So in Eminence, Kentucky, there was one teacher in a chemistry class who he had most of his class was 11th graders, so it was sort of like all 11th graders were taking chemistry at the same time. But he had worked out sort of a multi-step process within his class so that students could be working through the material at different paces. So there was sort of this foundation level where first students would have to do a math activity, partner work, some research on the topic, and then they would move up to what was called the exploration level. And that's when they could do sort of more of those lab experiments, making models and things like that. And students were working through those different levels at different paces. So it's not complete student choice there, but it does give them some flexibility in sort of how they're doing that and what they want to focus on when they get to that exploration level.
And just in a sort of bigger picture context too, you wrote about how time is the biggest barrier to doing this. Why is that the case?
Well, because the school day is pretty rigidly structured in most places, and there, if you're looking at middle school or high school especially, there are certain blocks of time for each subject. It can be hard to do whatever you need to do in that 40 minutes that you have to really personalize it for students. And then on the flip side of that, it's kind of hard to, if you wanted to break that structure apart and work throughout the day rather than within periods, you'd need to really have a whole school effort with multiple teachers. And that's what's happening in Pioneer Ridge Middle School in Chaska, Minnesota, which I wrote about in my story on this, where they're working cross disciplines to really break apart those period markers and let students move at their own pace there.
Maddie, you wrote about a really interesting trend called Genius Hour, where teachers give students the opportunity to pursue basically like projects that they're passionate about. Does it, struggle with some of the same issues that Sarah's talking about, time, rigid schedules, standardized testing, those kind of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of teachers were like, oh, that sounds great. I would love to do a Genius Hour, but how am I going to fit it in to the school day when we already have a lot of things to cover based off standards in the curriculum? Some teachers have gotten around it by tying the Genius Hour to the standards in the curriculum. I spoke with a middle school teacher who uses Genius Hour as an enrichment for her students. So after they complete a unit, the students work at their own pace. The students who have mastered it before their other classmates might do a passion project that they're interested and explore. In English class in high school, students can use Genius Hour to really get at some of those standards that might be tricky to put into a normal curriculum, like public speaking and research and using informational text.
And what are some of the biggest criticisms of the potential downsides of Genius Hour approaches?
Yeah, so I've had some, experts worry that if we're spending time on passion projects that might not be related to the school, or what are we losing out on? Are we losing out on content that's important for students to know? Or is this going to be a free-for-all for students? So there are ways that teachers can kind of make sure that they're holding their students accountable while also fostering that love of learning.
That idea of a free-for-all for students is something that came up a lot also when
Oh,
I
really?
was talking
Okay.
to teachers. So the principal of the school in Minnesota was saying there's this sort of misconception that teachers think personalized pacing is just sort of turning students loose in a packet or in an adaptive software program and only contacting the teacher if they need support. And this principal was saying, no, in reality, like the teacher is still really supporting students. They're just supporting each student at whatever point they're on in their own journey rather than supporting all students in the same place.
You know, and we talked about setting learning goals, and that was in the survey. We had survey results on that. How is that a challenge, as you know, when you're doing academic pacing, and it sounds like that could add to the free-for-all sort of, you know, environment.
Yeah. So the teachers at Pioneer Ridge were actually really intent on conveying the message that no, they are really checking in with each student and setting learning goals individually rather than just sort of being, okay, set your own learning goals. So as an example, they start every sort of unit with a group seminar. And then after that seminar, they check in with each student through some sort of formative assessment to say, okay, where are you with this content? Do you need us to put you in a sort of small group for some differentiated instruction around this? Are you okay to go and practice it on your own at this point? Or do you want to come back and sit in the seminar again and listen to it that way one more time before you sort of go forward and apply it?
So the teacher is very much involved in that then. It's not just setting them on a free-for-all.
Yeah.
And so did the teachers you talked to, did they like that approach, or did they find it, you know, too difficult, or?
The teachers I talked to liked it. They did say, you know, it's more, it's definitely a lot more sort of individual monitoring, and it can be more work. But I think they felt that it was worth it because it leads to better outcomes for the students. Was sort of what they were saying. There's also more sort of work around setting good habits. So one thing is that, you know, if you're giving students this kind of flexibility, you're also giving them responsibility, and they need to work on time management and other sort of soft skills. So they've built in these structures within their units that explicitly teach those skills so that students know how to do that as they move forward.
So Maddie, the headline of your story asked, would Albert Einstein have liked this?
Yeah.
So is there a specific subject that you tend to see Genius Hour in more than others, or is it, you know, sort of any subject?
It can really be anything. I think high school English is a popular one for high school because that's, research is just baked into that subject. And then elementary school, it was really great for that because kids can pick whatever subject they want, that they're passionate about, that they want to learn more.
And what was one of the more interesting projects that you learned about?
Well, one thing I thought was cool is that a lot of teachers will have, because it can kind of be overwhelming, I think, for teachers if all their students are working on different areas that they might not know a lot about themselves. So sometimes teachers will ask community experts to come in and serve as mentors for the students. So they, like one student worked with, I think, a local meteorologist about their project on weather. One student worked with the science teacher, even though it was an English class, about building a water purification system. So kind of incorporating those outside experts into the classroom lets students kind of get a bigger, like a wider breadth of knowledge.
So in today's summit, did the people who participated talk about a lot of the things you just mentioned? What different takes did some of the people in the audience have?
A lot of them were talking about those soft skills, the sort of time management, executive functioning skills, critical thinking skills. There were some comments from people who said, look, this sounds great, but it would be hard to do at my school because students are really in the habit of asking you exactly what you want to be done and on what timeline, and they feel uncomfortable and unsure when they're given flexibility. And I think that was something that Dana Miller, who's the principal at Pioneer Ridge, was really honest about. That takes a lot of time to sort of rebuild expectations around that.
I wanted to ask you, Maddie, I remember in your story, with some of the Genius Hour projects, students got credit for it.
Yes.
And with others, they didn't. How do you motivate a student to do something that they're not going to get credit for?
Yeah.
And you know, what are the benefits and drawbacks of both? approaches?
Yeah, so teachers who do Genius Hour will tell you that you don't necessarily need a grade to get to motivate students because they are so passionate about the project that they want to do it themselves. I had teachers tell me that their students would want to take the Genius Hour project home to work on it more, even though that wasn't required. So I think they say it's an intrinsic motivation, that the love of learning is really front and center. But at the same time, some experts and some skeptics will say, well, how are we going to keep students accountable and make sure that their quality of work is up to par without grades? So I think some teachers have found a middle ground where they're not grading the final project, the conclusion of the Genius Hour, but they are grading checkpoints along the way just to make sure that students are working.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Maddie. Thank you, audience, for joining us for our online summit and this discussion. I would encourage you to go to edweek.org and access our special report about personalized learning if you want to learn more about these topics.